the mute nurse who suddenly thinks she went to medical school. That's what Dr. Sterling had called her last week, and the word still hung in Sacred Heart Hospital's cardiac ICU like residual antiseptic, impossible to scrub away. Danielle Ross didn't know that in 72 hours, those words would echo in a federal hearing room. She didn't know that a man in uniform would fly 1,700 miles to correct the record. She didn't know that her hands, the ones people called unsteady, the one she kept hidden under long sleeves and clinical detachment, had already saved more lives than most surgeons see in a career. What she did know was that the fluorescent lights above her station hummed their mechanical song at 06 for 7 hours on a Tuesday morning, and she had 13 minutes to finish the overnight report before the day's shift arrived with their laughter and their belonging. Danielle moved through Sacred Heart's corridors like water moving downstream, present but not observed, necessary but not noticed. 8 years she'd been doing this, 8 years of arriving through the parking garage instead of the main entrance, 8 years of keeping her eyes exactly at shoulder height when she passed doctors in hallways so they wouldn't feel obligated to acknowledge her. The ICU doors hissed open at 0652, and she was already at the charge nurse station, 12-hour report clipboard in hand, when the first resident stumbled in with cold coffee and the particular exhaustion that comes from overnight trauma bay rotations. "Morning, Danielle," said Marcus, the first-year resident, the only one who actually used her name consistently. His eyes had that 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd spent the night watching people die. "Morning," she replied, voice just loud enough to be heard. Overnight was stable. Room 340 extubated at 0300. Room 343 spiked to fever at 0445, cultures pending, started empiric cephalosporin per protocol. Room 347 pain controlled, vital signs stable post-op day 2, Commander Hayes sleeping when I checked at 0530. Danielle's voice was the kind that didn't carry, didn't project, didn't demand anything from the world. It was the voice of someone who'd learned early that taking up space was a luxury she couldn't afford. She reported vitals with the precision of someone reciting established facts: BP, heart rate, O2 saturation, urine output, everything reduced to numbers and abbreviations, everything stripped of emotion. The other nurses gathered around the station now, and the conversation didn't include her. It never did. She finished the handoff and turned toward the patient rooms, leaving the report in its designated slot, her work complete and already forgotten. The cardiac ICU smelled like all cardiac ICUs smell, antiseptic and recycled air, and underneath that, something older, the specific scent of bodies working too hard to stay alive. Danielle moved through it like she moved through everything, with the kind of efficiency that came from not wasting a single motion. Each step measured. Each breath controlled. Each moment compartmentalized into its proper place. She'd been trained to move like this, taught to keep her mind clear and her hand steady and her voice low enough that nobody noticed you were there until they needed you to be. Room 347 had a patient named Commander Thomas Hayes, 63 years old, for vessel coronary artery disease, post-cab day 2. He was sleeping when she entered, his chest rising and falling with the determined rhythm of a man whose body was still learning how to survive without the surgeon's knife having opened it. She checked the cardiac monitor, sinus rhythm, good rate, no arrhythmias, then moved to the 4-pole to verify medication times against her documentation. The saline bag had exactly 380 milliliters remaining. The morphine concentration was correct. His post-op pain score had been 4 out of 10 at 0500, which meant the current regimen was working. She made notes in the electronic chart without making a sound, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the fluency of someone who'd documented thousands of nights. Danielle was checking the sterile dressing on Hayes's median sternotomy when he stirred, eyelids flickering. "Morning, sir," she said, keeping her voice soft so as not to startle him. "How's your pain?" "Manageable." His voice was rough from extubation, the kind of rough that came from having a breathing tube removed hours ago. "You're the nurse from overnight?" "Yes, sir." "For more hours until the day shift takes over." "You're efficient." He studied her for a moment in that particular way that military men study things, assessing, categorizing. "What's your name?" "Danielle, sir." She adjusted his oxygen cannula and checked the oxygen saturation reading, 98%, perfect. She didn't linger. Lingering created obligation, created the possibility of conversation, created the illusion that she was something more than a function in his recovery. She was the person who administered medications and monitored vital signs and caught complications before they became catastrophic, all while remaining invisible enough that he might forget she'd been there at all. The break room at 0900 was a small fluorescent-lit space with a microwave that smelled like someone's burnt coffee and a refrigerator that hummed like a tired animal. Danielle sat at the far end of the table with her lunch, turkey sandwich on wheat, an apple, a yogurt cup. She opened the latest issue of Critical Care Nursing Today and began reading, one page every 30 seconds, absorbing the information the way she absorbed most things, quietly, completely, without demanding recognition for doing so. Jessica, one of the day shift nurses, entered with her own lunch and made eye contact with the other two nurses already seated. Their conversation, which had been about some weekend plans, died the moment Danielle looked up. Jessica's jaw tightened. She turned to find a seat at the opposite end of the table instead, and the conversation resumed as if Danielle were made of air. "I'm telling you, he was completely inappropriate," Jessica was saying to Amber, another ICU nurse. "Like, I asked him a simple question about the post-op orders and he made some comment about me needing to go back to nursing school." Danielle turned another page. The article was about sepsis protocols. She read the entire thing while the women talked around her, and by the time she finished her sandwich, they'd moved on to hospital gossip and someone's miserable romantic situation. She remained untouched by it all, as if there were some invisible barrier between her and their world. That barrier had been constructed carefully, over 8 years, one invisible brick at a time. At 1000, Dr. Marcus Sterling arrived for his rounds. His arrival had a specific signature. You could hear him coming before you saw him, the way his shoes struck the tile floor with more authority than shoes should require, the way his voice preceded him into any room like he was announcing the arrival of someone important. He wore a watch that cost more than Danielle made in 3 months and a wedding ring that caught the fluorescent light when he gestured. His residents trailed behind him like ducklings, and the entire unit's energy shifted the moment he passed through the ICU doors. Danielle was at the medication cart, drawing up heparin for another patient, when Sterling's entourage moved past her position. She didn't look up. She knew better than to make eye contact. She kept her hand steady and her attention focused on the syringe in her hands, the measured lines on the barrel, the precise angle of the needle. Sterling didn't acknowledge her existence as he passed. He never did. To Dr. Sterling, Danielle Ross was part of the furniture, the 4 stands, the monitors, the walls themselves. "Conference room," he called to his residents, his voice carrying the particular tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Let's review today's post-ops before rounds." They disappeared down the hallway, and the unit seemed to exhale. The morning progressed the way mornings in the ICU always progress, medications and vital signs and careful attention to the 100 small details that kept hearts beating and lungs breathing. Danielle moved between rooms like someone navigating a familiar geography, each step purposeful, each task completed before moving to the next. She was in room 341, checking a femoral artery line, when she noticed something in the patient's medication infusion. The antibiotic was running at 15 milliliters per hour when the order specified 30 milliliters per hour. A simple error, probably from overnight, but the kind that could impact the effectiveness of infection control. She adjusted the rate and made a note in the chart, saying nothing to anyone. This was how she worked, catching things, fixing things, leaving no fingerprints. Sterling returned for rounds at 10:30, moving from room to room with the kind of surgical confidence that came from being very good at your job and knowing it. His residents presented each patient's overnight progress. He asked questions. He made recommendations. He was, when you weren't thinking about his particular cruelty, actually an excellent cardiac surgeon. The problem wasn't his competence. The problem was that his competence had given him permission to treat people who weren't his equal as if they barely existed. When he reached room 347, Commander Hayes was awake and alert. "How are we feeling, Commander?" Sterling asked, using the we in that particular way that doctors used it when they were actually asking about themselves. "Pain is controlled," Hayes said. "Ms. Ross here has been taking excellent care." Sterling didn't even glance in her direction. "Excellent," he said, as if Hayes had made a statement about the weather. "Vitals are looking good. We'll discuss discharge planning with cardiology, probably looking at 3 more days here, and then a full recovery timeline of 6 to 8 weeks. I want to see him stress tested before he goes home." Sterling turned on his heel and left, already asking the resident about the next patient. Danielle stayed in the room long enough to adjust Hayes's pillows and check his for dressing. "You need anything else, sir? You ever think about getting some recognition for what you do?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer. She simply finished her task and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. The afternoon shift change came at 1500, and Danielle gave report to Jessica with the same precision she'd given report that morning: complete, accurate, professional, unmemorable. Jessica took notes and didn't ask questions. By 1545, Danielle was walking out of Sacred Heart Hospital, her shift complete, her work already forgotten by everyone except the patients whose lives had been shaped by her attention to detail and her ability to catch the things that others missed. She drove home in silence, no radio, no distractions, just the sound of the engine and the particular rhythm of the traffic on Military Highway. Her apartment was small and clean and contained no photographs. No one had ever been inside it except the landlord. She had a refrigerator with basic groceries, a bed with hospital corners, a closet with scrubs and jeans and long-sleeved shirts, and on the top shelf, partially hidden by a stack of folded sweatshirts, a pair of combat boots with sand still embedded in the treads. Desert sand. Baghdad sand. A geography of memory she carried in the sole treads like classified information written in dust. She didn't look at the boots. She never did. But she knew they were there, the same way she knew her own heartbeat, present, constant, impossible to ignore if you actually paid attention. She made dinner, ate it alone, and reviewed her shift notes on her personal laptop, cross-referencing her observations with the latest sepsis protocols and post-operative cardiac care guidelines. This was how she spent her evenings, learning, absorbing, preparing for a future that involved being even more invisible than she'd already become. At 2,200 hours, as she was getting ready for bed, her personal phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. A single message: "Phantom, we need to talk. This is Marcus. Call when safe." She stared at the message for a long moment. Then she deleted it without responding, set her phone to silent, and lay down to sleep. Whatever the message meant, whatever reason someone had for using a call sign she hadn't heard in 8 years, it was a problem for someone else to solve. She was just a nurse now. Just Danielle. Just invisible. The anonymity had saved her. It was the only armor she had left. The mute nurse who suddenly thinks she went to medical school. That's what Dr. Sterling called her in front of Commander Hayes's entire family. He had no idea who was lying in room 347. She had no idea that the man she was quietly trying to save had promised her son he would come home alive from Baghdad. The truth didn't just change everything that morning, it ended careers. But first, it destroyed her. Danielle moved through the morning vitals on room 347 with the same practiced invisibility that had become her armor. Commander Hayes was 62, 3 days post-CABG, and his body was telling her a story that the monitors were only beginning to whisper. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his left arm, routine, mechanical, the kind of task she could perform in her sleep after 17 years of nursing. The systolic pressure read 118. She waited. The diastolic dropped to 64. That gap was widening. That gap was dangerous. She leaned closer, listening to his heart sounds through her stethoscope, the one she'd carried since her discharge from the Navy, battered and scratched but still precise. There. A muffled quality to the S1 and S2, as if something between his heart and the world was absorbing the sound. His jugular venous distension was subtle, barely visible above his collarbone, but it was there. She traced the line of his neck with her eyes, following the pattern of pressure that shouldn't exist on day 3 post-op. The triad was forming. Beck's triad. Elevated venous pressure. Muffled heart sounds. Narrowing pulse pressure. The textbook presentation of pericardial effusion, fluid accumulating around his heart, the pressure building like a fist slowly closing around a bird. She documented the findings in the chart with clinical precision, her handwriting small and controlled, noted JVD, muffled S1, S2, BP trending downward with narrowed pulse pressure. Recommend echocardiogram to assess for postoperative effusion. Then she returned the chart to the foot of his bed and waited for rounds. Dr. Sterling arrived at 8:19 a.m., moving through the cardiac wing with the presence of a man who'd never once questioned whether the room should rearrange itself around him. Behind him trailed four residents in white coats, their spines curved in the posture of people trying to disappear, and stationed at the foot of Commander Hayes's bed were his wife of 38 years, two adult daughters in business suits who'd driven up from Richmond, and a grandson holding a balloon that said "Get well soon" in cheerful blue letters. Sterling pulled up the morning labs without looking at Danielle, his focus entirely on the family. "Commander, your bypass graft is patent, your troponin levels are normalizing, and you're progressing beautifully. By next week you'll be home telling stories about how you survived open-heart surgery." The family smiled. The grandson bobbed the balloon. Everything was fine. Everything was under control. Danielle approached from the side of the bed, moving into Sterling's line of sight during the examination. She kept her voice low, speaking only to him, only the clinical facts. "Dr. Sterling, I'm concerned about possible tamponade developing. His Beck's triad indicators are present, elevated JVD, muffled heart sounds, and pulse pressure narrowing from 54 to 40 over the last 4 hours. An echo to rule out pericardial effusion might." Sterling turned slowly. His eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise, the kind of expression a man uses when he's discovered something beneath a rock. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice loud enough that every person in the room stopped moving. "Did the mute nurse just diagnose my post-surgical patient?" The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Danielle could taste it. "The same nurse," Sterling continued, gesturing toward her as if she were a specimen, "who hasn't strung together 10 words in 2 years, suddenly thinks she went to medical school." He turned to face the family directly, his smile bright and cruel. "Nursing school teaches vital signs monitoring, not cardiac pathology. But thank you, Nurse Ross, for your WebMD-level contribution. Perhaps stick to bedpans and leave the actual diagnosis to people with actual medical degrees." The daughters exchanged glances. The wife's face tightened. The grandson lowered the balloon slowly. One of the residents studied the floor with intense focus, as if something crucial might be written there. Another resident's jaw clenched, the subtle tension of someone who knew better but lacked the authority to say it. Danielle took one measured breath. She felt the heat climb her neck, a flush that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with a 17-year-old muscle memory of keeping her composure while shells fell outside the surgical tent. Her hands remained at her sides. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady as a surgical laser. She met Sterling's eyes without flinching. "I hope you never need someone to question your judgment when it matters, Doctor." Sterling's face darkened. His jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle working at the corner of his face. "My office. Tomorrow morning." His voice had dropped to something that sounded like the idling of a tank in a garage. He turned back to Hayes without another word, resumed his examination with exaggerated precision, and finished rounds while Danielle stood motionless at the foot of the bed, her hands folded, her expression neutral as concrete. But what that family didn't know was that Commander Hayes had heard every word. His eyes had tracked Danielle during the entire exchange. And when Sterling finally left the room, Hayes reached out his left hand, the one not connected to 4 lines, and squeezed his wife's arm. He whispered something she couldn't hear. She nodded slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to something harder. Something like recognition. The next morning, Danielle arrived at 6:22 a.m. to find her name on the unit board in Sterling's precise handwriting. Under Personnel Notes in the Clinical Update section, D. Ross, overstepping scope of practice, undermining physician authority during family conference. Recommend formal retraining on scope boundaries. Flagged for performance review. The words were professional. The message was a surgical strike. She read them once, memorized the exact phrasing, and walked to her assigned patients. There was no point in arguing. Sterling's brother sat on the hospital board. Sterling had allies who returned his calls. Danielle had 17 years of quiet competence and a nursing license she'd worked too hard to lose. By Thursday, the isolation had calcified into something visible and undeniable. In the break room at noon, Danielle sat at her usual table with her usual turkey sandwich and a cup of black coffee. 3 nurses at the adjacent table were discussing weekend plans, something about a concert in Virginia Beach, traffic on I-64. Danielle opened her phone to scroll through the medical literature app she used during lunch. One of the nurses glanced over, made eye contact for exactly half a second, and then the conversation stopped. The 3 of them gathered their containers and relocated to the far corner of the break room, their voices resuming only once they'd created physical distance. A resident who'd smiled at her during the previous week's shift now studied his phone with the intensity of a man reading nuclear launch codes. 2 nurses from the overnight shift, women she'd helped orient when they were new, pivoted sharply when she approached the coffee station and suddenly became urgent about checking the medication dispensary down the hall. Sterling made sure to ensure the message was reinforced. He stopped by the break room on Thursday afternoon while she was eating, speaking loudly to the charge nurse near the doorway. Performance reviews next month, by the way. Some people simply cannot work within established hierarchies. Career-limiting behaviors, really. It's unfortunate when nurses forget their role. He made a point of not looking at Danielle as he said it. That made it worse somehow. The message was louder in his silence. She chewed methodically. Swallowed. Returned to her journal article on battlefield trauma management, a paper from the 2019 Combat Medic Conference she'd been reading for 3 years, the margins filled with clinical notes in her precise handwriting. By Friday, she'd stopped coming to the break room entirely. She ate lunch in the stairwell on the 3rd floor, sitting on the concrete landing where no one would find her, where the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song and the only sound was the distant echo of elevator cables. But the thing that nobody at Sacred Heart Hospital knew, not Sterling, not the charge nurse, not the residents or the nurses or the department administrators, was that Commander Hayes was getting worse. His blood pressure was trending downward in a pattern that looked like a slow leak in a tire, nothing dramatic, nothing immediately dangerous, just a gradual descent from 118 for 64 to 112 for 59 to 108 for 55. His heart rate was creeping upward to compensate, the monitor showing 88 beats per minute on admission, 94 on day 2, now pushing 102 on day 3. The oxygen saturation required incremental increases, the nasal cannula bumped from 2 liters to 3 liters to 4 liters as if his body was slowly running out of air. Sterling adjusted medications with the confidence of a man who didn't doubt himself. He added diuretics to manage what he diagnosed as routine postoperative fluid retention. He modified the beta-blocker dosing. He ordered repeat labs that came back reassuringly normal because labs measured blood chemistry, not the subtle pressure building in the sac surrounding a man's heart. Danielle documented her observations in the chart with the kind of clinical language that left no room for interpretation or personal opinion. Continued monitoring of vital sign trends. HR elevated for post-op day 3. O2 requirements gradually increasing. JVD visually apparent at 45-degree recline position. Recommend physician reassessment. Sterling's response was written underneath her entry in blue ink, nursing concerns reviewed and deemed inconsistent with clinical presentation. Postoperative tachycardia is expected. No changes to treatment plan. Then he called the nursing supervisor and requested Danielle's reassignment off his service, citing interpersonal conflict affecting patient care and team dynamics. The supervisor, whose name was Carol and who'd worked at Sacred Heart for 23 years and had seen Sterling destroy 3 previous careers, called Danielle into her office on Friday afternoon. "We're moving you to General MedSurg starting Monday," Carol said gently. "Nothing personal. It's better this way." Danielle said only, "Yes," and accepted the transfer with the same quiet compliance that had kept her invisible for 5 years. That evening, At exactly 6:11 p.m. Norfolk time, Danielle's phone rang with the particular ringtone she'd assigned to only one contact. Her son Marcus, calling from Forward Operating Base Shank in Logar Province, Afghanistan, where the temperature was 37 degrees and the sunset was the color of blood. "Hey, Mom," he said, and his voice was exactly what she needed to hear and exactly what she couldn't bear to hear all at once. "How was work?" She told him fine, everything's fine, how are you? And he described a new commanding officer who'd transferred in, tough but fair, older guy who actually gave a damn about his troops. He said the name like it meant something, like this officer was the difference between Marcus coming home and Marcus becoming a name on a wall. "What's his name?" Danielle asked, her hand freezing on the phone. "Commander Robert Hayes." "He's a lifer, Mom. Been everywhere. Guys say he's the reason the last patrol came back intact when it probably shouldn't have. Like he can sense things before they happen." Danielle closed her eyes. The connection between Norfolk and Baghdad compressed into a single moment of terrible clarity. The man Sterling was slowly killing with contempt was the same man keeping her son alive halfway around the world. "Be safe, baby," she whispered into the phone. The phone call came at 1447 hours on a Thursday, before Danielle finished her documentation on the second floor. Dr. Sterling's voice carried the particular smoothness of a man who'd already won before speaking. "Chief of Staff Morrison?" "Yes, I'm concerned about a pattern." "Nurse Ross." "Excellent clinical instincts, absolutely, but there's a boundary issue we should document. 3 separate instances this month alone. Just want to make sure we have everything in the record." He paused, letting silence do the work. "I understand completely. Preventive measure." "Exactly." Danielle didn't hear the call herself. She heard about it from Jenny Chen, the unit clerk who'd overheard Morrison's secretary scheduling a meeting with Sterling for Monday at 0800. Jenny delivered the news in a whisper near the med dispenser, her eyes avoiding Danielle's. "I thought you should know," Jenny said, which meant everyone would know by 1600. The hospital rumor mill moved like an IV drip, slow, steady, impossible to stop once started. By Friday morning, the restriction came through in writing. Temporary reassignment of responsibilities pending performance review, no autonomous decision-making authority on cardiac units, cardiac patients require physician approval before any intervention or modification to care plan. The words were bureaucratic, surgical in their precision. Not a demotion. Not yet. Something more insidious, a cage with bars so polished you didn't see them until you tried to move. Sterling had activated his network with the precision of a man who'd played this game before. His brother-in-law sat on the hospital board. His mentor headed cardiology at Johns Hopkins, a voice that carried institutional weight. He'd collected allies the way some men collected watches, carefully, expensively, and for exactly moments like this. Danielle watched him move through the unit on Friday afternoon, his white coat trailing behind him like a cape, stopping to chat with Morrison about concerning patents and fiduciary responsibility. The door to the stairwell was unmarked, easy to miss. Danielle found it at 14:10 on Friday, her break time, pushing through with her ID badge still clipped to her scrubs. The concrete stairs were cold, winter cold that had nothing to do with temperature. She sat 3 flights down from the cardiac unit, where the ventilation system hummed its mechanical song and no one's footsteps echoed except hers. Her hands were steady. That was the problem. Steady hands meant control, and control was becoming a luxury she couldn't afford. Around her, the hospital continued its organized chaos, monitors beeping, pneumatic tube systems whooshing patient charts through walls, the intercom crackling overhead with codes and announcements. But down here, in the concrete stairwell with its flickering fluorescent light, there was only silence and the sound of her own breathing. Commander Hayes had declined in 72 hours. His blood pressure dropped from 128/78 Wednesday morning to 101/62 by Thursday evening. His respiratory rate climbed from 18 to 26. His jugular veins were distending, a thin blue line visible beneath the skin of his neck that told her everything Sterling's dismissal wouldn't acknowledge. The man was drowning in his own pericardial fluid, his heart compressed like a fist closing around something fragile. She documented every change. Temperature at 10:45 Thursday, 99.8. Resp rate, 24. She'd watched the monitor strip when no one was looking, that subtle flattening of the QRS complex that screamed cardiac tamponade. She'd reviewed his imaging 3 times on the hospital system, comparing Wednesday's echocardiogram to yesterday's, seeing the fluid collection expand like a storm on radar. But Sterling had written the orders. Sterling had written continue current management and reassess Monday. Sterling had adjusted Hayes's for pump himself Friday afternoon, standing in the patient's room with his expensive watch catching the overhead lights, telling Danielle she belonged on the 4th floor changing colostomy bags where she'd actually understand scope of practice. Her head pressed against the cold concrete wall. Not trembling. Not breaking. Just breathing, the way they'd taught her to breathe in places with names she didn't speak aloud anymore. In through the nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth for 4. The kind of breathing you did when your nervous system was screaming and your voice had to stay level. A single tear escaped her left eye. Just one. Not despair, pain was information, and this pain told her that the system protecting Sterling was bigger than she could fight alone. Going over his head meant the board would listen to him first. She had no credentials here, no history, no witnesses to her past. Just a quiet nurse who'd suggested a medication adjustment and received a write-up for her trouble. She wiped the tear away with her thumb, the motion precise and controlled. Her hand returned to her lap. She sat in that stairwell for 6 minutes, long enough for her voice to find its center again, for her shoulders to drop from where tension had raised them, for the small voice in her head that screamed to be heard to accept that screaming wouldn't help Commander Hayes. The man with the pericardial effusion, the man keeping her son alive in a place where IEDs were buried in roads and trust was the most dangerous thing you could give anyone, that man was drowning in real time and Sterling was at a fundraiser. She stood slowly. Her shift continued for 4 more hours. Hayes's vitals would be documented every 30 minutes. She would watch, and record, and wait for permission that wouldn't come until it was too late. Unless someone decided that permission was a luxury they no longer had time to request. Her voice, when she spoke to herself in the stairwell, was calm. Measured. The voice of a woman who'd made peace with a choice that didn't have a good option, only options that varied in how much they cost. I hope you never need someone to question your judgment when it matters. The words hung in the concrete stairwell like a prayer to no one. No one who was listening anyway. She climbed the stairs back toward the unit, her badge clipped to scrubs that smelled of antiseptic and something older, something like the dust of places that didn't forgive mistakes. The unit was normal when she returned. Normal meant monitors beeping their digital rhythm, normal meant nurses charting at computers, normal meant Dr. Sterling's office chair empty because he was in his tuxedo somewhere on the waterside, accepting congratulations for his vision and his commitment to cardiac excellence. Hayes slept with his wife's hand in his, both of them unaware that the clock was running on something Sterling didn't understand and Danielle couldn't stop alone. She checked the crash cart at 14:31. Defibrillator pads charged and ready. Medications organized, epinephrine in the top drawer, atropine in the second. The ultrasound machine was positioned near the code station, close enough to grab, far enough not to be questioned. She touched nothing. She didn't need to. Her hands knew exactly where everything was. Her hands had held worse than this in the dark. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent to what was coming, as Danielle clocked back in and returned to room 347, where a commander was running out of time and a quiet nurse was about to learn the difference between following protocol and saving a life. The code came through at 2:07 a.m. Commander Hayes's heart rate 142, blood pressure collapsing like a building mid-demolition. His wife pushed the call button. A resident answered. The monitors screamed their electronic language, the unmistakable signs of cardiac tamponade, fluid compressing the heart, stealing its ability to pump. Dr. Sterling didn't answer his phone. He was 2 miles away at the hospital's annual fundraiser, drink in hand, telling a story about a difficult patient he'd managed brilliantly. Danielle was documenting vitals on the 3rd floor when the charge nurse found her. Room 347. Now. No, please. No apology for the earlier restrictions. Just the bare command that transcended hierarchy when lives hung in the balance. She moved without hesitation, muscle memory older than her civilian identity, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The ultrasound machine caught her hand as she passed the supply closet. Heavy. Awkward. She carried it anyway. The resident, a Dr. Patterson, young enough that his hand still trembled during complex procedures, was already at Hayes's bedside when she arrived. The monitor showed the characteristic electrical-mechanical dissociation of a man whose heart was being strangled from the inside. Hayes's wife gripped his hand like she was trying to anchor him to consciousness. Danielle wheeled the ultrasound to the bedside and spoke quietly to Patterson, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what came next. You're going to document that I performed this procedure against your direct orders. Protect yourself. Patterson's mouth opened. Closed. He nodded, understanding that she was giving him cover, building a record that placed the decision at his feet, that protected his career and his future. Medical hierarchy was a luxury they couldn't afford at 2:13 a.m. She prepped Hayes's chest with betadine, the iodine smell sharp and ancient, a scent that had become muscle memory in a different hospital, in a different lifetime. Fallujah, 2018. A field tent with mortar rounds shaking the canvas. Ramadi, the same year. A helicopter with hydraulic fluid leaking and a marine with a sucking chest wound. Helmand Province. Always Helmand. The same movements. The same steady hands that had stopped bleeding in conditions that would make this sterile operating environment look like a luxury suite. The ultrasound showed it immediately, massive pericardial effusion, the dark blood surrounding Hayes's heart like a siege. The heart itself a pale struggling muscle, compressed and suffocating. She selected the pericardiocentesis kit from the crash cart, hands moving with the fluid precision of a weapon system that knew its target. Needle. Syringe. The landmarks came without thought, xiphoid process and left costal margin, angle 45 degrees toward the left shoulder. The same angle she'd learned in a training facility that no longer existed, taught by instructors who hadn't come home. Patterson whispered, "You can't. You're a nurse. This is..." She didn't look at him. "Then stop me." He didn't move. The needle slid through skin, through tissue, past the pericardium's outer membrane, and she felt the characteristic give or a sensation like pushing through fabric, a distinct shift that told her she'd entered the space where blood was stealing her patient's life. Dark blood filled the syringe immediately. Thick. Nearly black. The pericardial fluid of a man whose heart had been drowning for hours while protocols and hierarchies and the arrogance of a surgeon at a black-tie fundraiser kept her voice from mattering. Hayes's pressure shifted on the monitor. 82/52. Then 90/58. The heart rate dropped from 118 to 94 as she withdrew 200 milliliters of blood, the pressure inside the pericardial sac releasing like air escaping a punctured tire. His color improved from the gray of a man dying to the pink of a man returning to life. His wife made a sound, not quite a word, something between prayer and relief. Patterson stared like he was witnessing a magic trick performed in real time. His hand shook as he documented what he'd just seen, a nurse performing a procedure that only a physician could legally perform, violating every protocol and regulation that separated her credential from his, and doing it because the alternative was watching a commander die while waiting for permissions that wouldn't come in time. By 2:20, Hayes's eyes were open. Conscious. Squeezing his wife's hand with returning strength. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm. The monitors sang in normal cadence. The procedure tray lay on the bedside with the needle and syringe and the evidence of everything she'd just done. At 2:38, Dr. Sterling arrived in khakis and an untucked tuxedo shirt, his bow tie hanging loose around his neck like a rope. His shoes still held the shine of expensive polish. He froze in the doorway of room 347, processing what his eyes were telling him. Commander Hayes alive. Conscious. the pericardiocentesis kit on the procedure tray. His face moved through 5 distinct colors: confusion, understanding, and then something darker. Rage with nowhere to aim itself at first, then finding its target. He didn't say a word. He stepped into the hallway and pulled his phone out with the precision of someone reaching for a weapon. For calls. First, Chief of Staff. We have a significant problem. Second, hospital attorney. Immediate documentation required. Third and fourth, board members whose brothers he played golf with. Men who understood that his call was not a request but a summons. His voice on the phone carried the tone of a man whose institutional power had been his armor for so long he'd forgotten what happened when someone stepped outside the rules he'd written. By 2:52, the Chief of Staff was on speakerphone in the administrator's office, his voice crackling through the speaker with bureaucratic fury. Immediate suspension. Full investigation. Chain of custody on all materials from room 347. By 3:15, Sterling had completed a 5-page incident report in font size 12, margins precisely 1 inch, citing gross protocol violation, practicing medicine without a license, patient endangerment, and conduct unbecoming a member of the nursing profession. Every word a nail in a coffin he was building with his own hands. Security arrived at 5:10 a.m. 2 officers in dark uniforms, young men who'd been told to escort the nurse from the building. They were polite about it. Professional. That made it worse somehow. Danielle moved to her locker in the staff room, retrieved her purse from the shelf, took her jacket from the hook. Her eyes fell on the pair of worn combat boots sitting on the floor of that locker, sand still visible in the treads, particles of earth from a day she'd walked away from everything she'd been. She'd changed out of them 8 years ago and never put them back on. She left them there. Sterling stood in the hallway, blocking her path just enough to be noticed, wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He spoke loudly enough for the charge nurse to hear, loud enough for everyone within earshot to understand the hierarchy he was restoring. Some people simply cannot accept their limitations, he said. Not to her. About her. Past her. As if she were already invisible again. She didn't respond. She walked past him toward the exit, and her silence carried more weight than any argument could have. The voice transformation hadn't happened yet. That would come. But something in her posture had changed. Something in the way she moved, not deferential now, not small. Efficient. Direct. The movement pattern of someone who'd walked away from battlefields and was walking away from this one too. The Norfolk dawn was breaking grey and cold. Rain started falling as she reached her car, soft at first, then harder, as if the sky was crying what she wouldn't allow herself to cry in public. She sat in the driver's seat for 3 minutes before starting the engine. In her scrubs. Still. The residue of one life clinging to her while another life, the one she'd tried to bury, was about to resurrect itself in the most public way possible. What she didn't know was that in room 347, Commander Hayes was asking for her. What she didn't know was that his single word, spoken quietly but with the kind of authority that made hospital administrators pale, was about to change everything. What she didn't know was that the quiet voice she'd heard so many times from Baghdad was about to speak her name. Commander Hayes opened his eyes at 3:33 p.m., the cardiac monitor showing a steady rhythm that had been flatlined 6 hours earlier. His first word wasn't pain or gratitude. It was a single name, spoken quietly but with the kind of authority that made nurses pause mid-step and administrators freeze in doorways. Phantom. The word hung in the ICU like a command that had traveled through time, through years, through battlefields on the other side of the world. The nurse who heard it, a young resident named Chen, felt her spine straighten involuntarily. She had no idea what that word meant. She had no idea that the decorated commander in room 347 had just spoken the call sign of the only person on his team who'd never frozen, never hesitated, and never once told him it was impossible. Dr. Sterling arrived at Sacred Heart at 6:23 a.m., still wearing the tuxedo from the hospital fundraiser, his face flushed and his breathing shallow with the kind of rage that only came from losing control. He went directly to the Chief of Staff's office and made phone calls that took exactly 17 minutes. First to the Chief of Staff, then to the hospital's legal counsel, then to 2 board members, one of whom was his golf buddy and the other his brother-in-law. His voice was ice and certainty, gross violation of protocol, practicing medicine without a license, endangering a patient, gross insubordination. He had it handled. By sunrise, Danielle would be escorted from the building. By Monday, her name would be buried so deep in personnel files that no one would ever question the clinical decisions on Hayes' case. But what Sterling didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that Rodriguez, the hospital's IT specialist and a Marine veteran with a USMC bulldog tattooed on his forearm, had been monitoring the security footage network at 4:24 that morning when Sterling's user ID logged in with administrative credentials he shouldn't have possessed. Rodriguez watched the screen, feeling the cold certainty settle into his chest like a sniper's breath before the shot. Sterling navigated to the ICU camera feeds. Found the timestamp for Danielle's procedure. Click delete. Rodriguez had been a signals officer for 6 years before becoming IT, and his instincts operated on a different frequency than normal hospital staff. He'd already backed up every frame to 3 separate drives and a cloud server before Sterling's cursor even hovered over the trash bin. Now Rodriguez walked into the Chief of Staff's office carrying a laptop and an expression that made the hospital's most senior administrator sit back in his chair. The room was already tense. Sterling stood with his arms crossed, radiating certainty. Rodriguez set the laptop on the mahogany desk without speaking and pressed play. The footage showed Sterling at 4:31 a.m., attempting to delete the ICY camera recording of Danielle's pericardiocentesis. Then Rodriguez pulled up the emails. Timestamped, documented, damning. Sterling to a board member, the quiet little nurse situation will be buried by Monday. I've got it handled. Sterling to the hospital attorney, we need her gone before anyone questions the clinical decisions on Hayes. A text to another physician, timestamped 5:53 a.m., sometimes you have to crush people to maintain order. The Chief of Staff read each email, and his face went the color of hospital walls, a shade between white and nothing. Sterling opened his mouth. Closed it. His hand moved toward the laptop. Rodriguez didn't move. Just stood there, solid as concrete, and let Sterling understand that this wasn't a conversation anymore. This was a record. This was evidence. This was over. By Tuesday morning, Sterling was on administrative leave pending investigation. By Wednesday, a SEAL team leader from Virginia Beach, the kind of man who moved through space like wind moving around a stone wall, who didn't ask permission and didn't wait for invitation, stood in the hospital's main conference room with Commander Hayes beside him, still moving slowly but moving with purpose. The board member Sterling had called, the one whose brother he played golf with, suddenly had very clear memories of a conversation where he'd told Sterling he couldn't possibly interfere with personnel matters. The hospital attorney issued a memo stating that he provided no legal guidance on the Ross situation and had serious concerns about Dr. Sterling's characterization of their conversation. The lawyer's signature carried weight. The memo carried consequences. On Thursday, the medical board opened a formal investigation into Sterling's treatment decisions on Hayes' case, discovering that he'd ignored clear tamponade indicators, refused nursing escalations, and documented his dismissal of Danielle's clinical observations in a way that made the board members exchange looks that required no words. A patient advocate named Maria, someone who'd been quietly documenting complaints for 3 years, stepped forward with a file. 3 previous cases. 3 patients whose outcomes had been affected by Sterling's retaliatory behavior toward staff who questioned him. 1 nurse had transferred out of cardiac care entirely. Another had left the hospital. The 3rd had simply stopped speaking in rounds, going silent the way Danielle had learned to go silent, absorbing the pressure like flesh absorbs bullets. Sterling's hospital privileges were suspended on Friday. His email was deactivated at 9:44 a.m. His nameplate was removed from the physician's board by 10:13 a.m., leaving a rectangle of unfaded paint where his credentials had been printed. He sat in his Audi A6 in the parking garage for 2 hours, hands on the steering wheel, watching colleagues walk past, the same colleagues who'd laughed at his jokes last week, who'd stood beside him at the fundraiser, who now walked faster and looked away. His brother-in-law sent a text at 2:17 p.m., "Can't help you. You made this too visible." Sterling read the message and realized, with the kind of clarity that only comes from absolute loss, that he had nowhere to go where people didn't know what he'd done. Nowhere to hide from the simple, unavoidable fact he'd tried to destroy a decorated war hero to protect his reputation, and the world had watched him do it. But that wasn't the worst part for Sterling. The worst part was that Danielle didn't respond. Didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't even acknowledge him. She simply moved forward. She moved forward the way soldiers move forward when the war is over, not with victory marches, but with quiet competence and the understanding that survival was its own monument. She moved forward because that's what people do when they've already survived everything else. 6 months later, a nursing student named Ashley doing clinical rotations at Sacred Heart paused at the Janaf shopping center, her eyes catching on a familiar figure hunched at a folding table between a tax preparation service and a vape shop. It took her a moment to recognize him without the white coat, without the authority radiating from him like heat. Dr. Marcus Sterling in a polo shirt with an insurance company logo, hands on the table, trying to make eye contact with people who hurried past. He'd aged years in months. His face carried the kind of exhaustion that comes from knowing everyone knows. Ashley didn't stop. She walked faster, the way humans do when they witness the specific weight of earned consequence. Inside Sacred Heart's new trauma education center, a space that gleamed with surgical lighting and new equipment, Danielle stood before 40 nursing students, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had echoed through field hospitals under fire. She wore navy blue scrubs, her movements precise and economical, each gesture meaning something. On the corner of her desk sat a pair of worn combat boots, sand still in the treads, visible to everyone who looked. Beside the boots lay a single medal in its case, a Navy Cross, the kind of decoration that survivors rarely speak about because the weight of it requires no words. "Protocol matters," Danielle said, her voice low but carrying to the back of the room. "Protocol saves lives. But sometimes patients die while you wait for permission." A cocky third-year resident interrupted, the kind of student who'd learned to argue before he'd learned to listen. "But hospital protocol says we can't," Danielle let the silence stretch. Not uncomfortably. Just long enough that he understood the difference between protocol and wisdom. "Your job," she said quietly, "is knowing which is which." Commander Hayes stood in the doorway in his dress uniform, not yet authorized for full duty but authorized to speak, to witness, to validate. He looked at the students and saw himself at 23, saw the moment he'd understood what Danielle understood. He told them about waking up alive. About the moment his eyes opened and the first thing he saw was the monitor showing a heartbeat that shouldn't have been there. "She chose right over easy," he said. "That's the difference between protocol and heroism. Heroes know the difference." Marcus, Danielle's son, stood in the back of the room in his army dress uniform, on leave before his next deployment to Kandahar. He watched his mother teach, finally understanding where she'd gone all those years ago, finally understanding why. He'd known she'd served. He hadn't known she was a legend. He hadn't known she was the reason his commanding officer had pulled him aside that first week and told him, "Your mother's name is on a wall at Coronado. You understand what that means? You understand that your DNA carries some things other people have to learn." Now, watching her teach, he understood. After class, a young nurse approached Danielle nervously, the kind of nervous that comes from asking someone braver than you to explain how they became brave. "How did you know?" the nurse asked. "How did you know to act when everyone said wait?" Danielle looked at the boots on her desk. She picked one up, felt the weight, the sand, the miles. She set it down carefully. "I learned in places where there was no one else to ask," she said quietly. "You learn here while you have support. You learn so when you're alone, really alone, you're ready." Marcus approached as the room emptied, and his mother stood. They hugged the way soldiers hug, brief, controlled, everything important said in the pressure of it. She held on 5 seconds longer than necessary. Outside, Sterling sat at his folding table, watching another person walk past without stopping, and checked his phone to see 0 messages. Inside, Danielle returned to her desk, picked up her lesson plan for next week, and began writing with the same steady hands that had held lives together. A student paused by the boots and asked if they meant something special. Danielle met their eyes and said, "True class is what you do when the lights go out. Everything else is just performance." The fluorescent lights of the trauma center hummed above her, that sound that never stopped, that sound that was just part of the background of hospitals everywhere. But in this room, in this moment, that sound carried something different. It carried recognition. It carried purpose. It carried the simple, quiet knowledge that the person teaching them had walked through fire and chosen to spend the rest of her life helping others walk through theirs. Some nurses were invisible because they chose to be. Some were invisible because the world wasn't ready to see them. But Danielle Ross was invisible no longer. And that, finally, was everything. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your strength, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Your stories matter. They remind us all that quiet strength is still strength. Thank you for listening.